My husband went to the bank every Tuesday at exactly 9:15 a.m. For 38 years of marriage, he never missed a single week. Not on holidays, not during snowstorms, not even the year he broke his hip. People used to laugh and say he was dedicated, but deep down, I knew there was something else behind those Tuesday mornings, something he never wanted me to see. And here is the part I have never said out loud. The day he died, I felt relief, a quiet, impossible relief that frightened me more than the loss itself. I didn't understand why. Not then. Everything changed 3 days later, when a letter arrived from the bank, a polite, simple envelope, inviting me to open a safe deposit box I never knew existed. My name was listed as the secondary holder, and the box had been paid for every single Tuesday for nearly 4 decades. When I walked into that vault, I thought I was ready, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I found inside. Not the files, not the hidden envelopes, not the truth about the man I thought I knew. And if you stay with me, I'll show you the one thing inside that box that didn't just change my life, it destroyed the story I'd been living in for 38 years. Before we open that box together, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the rest of this story or the ones that will help you see your own life more clearly. Now, are you ready to find out what a husband can hide for nearly 4 decades? I was in the kitchen that morning, stirring oatmeal on the stove, when the phone rang. It was strange, because Thomas almost never called me from the garage. He usually just walked back inside, brushing off the cold like it was nothing. But that morning, the phone rang once, then stopped. I didn't think much of it. I set the bowl on the table, opened the curtains, and waited for him to come in like he always did. He never did. It was our neighbor, Mr. Jensen, who found him, collapsed beside the workbench, one hand still curled around a rag he'd been using to wipe grease from the tools. I remember standing in the doorway of the garage, my breath turning to fog in the cold Vermont air, looking at my husband of 38 years lying so still that it felt like the world had stopped moving. The paramedics said it was quick. A stroke so sudden, his body didn't have time to fight it. People always say he didn't suffer, as if that's supposed to make the living feel better. It didn't. But here is the part I didn't say to anyone. Not to my children, not to the kind neighbors who brought casseroles and flowers, not even to the pastor who came to sit with me. When they told me Thomas was gone, I felt something loosen inside me, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. It frightened me so much, I spent the first night sitting in the dark, hands shaking, asking myself what kind of wife feels relief after losing her husband. I didn't have an answer. The house looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. His coat still hung by the door. His boots still sat on the mat. A thin trail of dried mud leading toward the garage. Everything looked so normal, as if he would walk back in, complaining about the cold, asking what was for dinner. But the silence was heavier than grief. My daughter, Laura, flew in the next morning. She cried the moment she stepped into the house, and she cried again at the sight of her father's slippers by the bed. For her, Thomas was warm, safe, unshakably dependable. The father who repaired her bike 3 times a year because she rode it too recklessly. The man who wrote her notes during finals week and mailed her care packages through college. She couldn't understand why I just sat there, why my hands were folded, why my eyes were dry. My son, Michael, arrived later that afternoon. He didn't cry. He hugged me tightly, studying my face like he could see something I wasn't saying. Then he went into Thomas's office, because that was always his way of dealing with things. Look for the facts. Look for order. But instead of order, he found something else. "Mom," he said quietly, holding a stack of documents I had never seen in my life. "We need to talk about Dad's accounts." I frowned. "What accounts?" He laid them out on the table. Statements, closing notices, zero balances. Our retirement fund, something Thomas had sworn was healthy and solid, was nowhere in the records. Not a single trace. I shook my head. "That can't be right. Your father kept everything organized. He color-coded bills for fun." But Michael's face said everything. He had 3 checking accounts in his name only. All of them are empty. One was closed last year. "Mom, there's nothing left." I felt the same tilt in the room that I had felt the day Thomas died. A strange, slow shifting of reality, as if something long buried had finally begun to surface. I whispered, "But he went to the bank every Tuesday." My voice cracked on the word Tuesday, because that routine had been the one constant in our marriage. Birthdays, holidays, storms, surgeries. Thomas always left the house at exactly 9:15 a.m. on Tuesdays. He would adjust his entire week around that one ritual. He always said it was about our future, a future he insisted I didn't need to worry about. Now, sitting at the kitchen table with empty accounts spread before me, I wondered if that future had already vanished years ago without me knowing. Michael exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Mom, do you know about a safe deposit box?" I stared at him. "What box?" He shook his head. "According to the bank records, Dad has one, paid in advance, renewed every year." My heart dropped. Thomas had told me everything, from the price of a gallon of milk to each detail of the Christmas lights he liked to string across the porch. But a safe deposit box, he had never said a word. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a postal worker holding a single envelope. "Mrs. Carter certified mail from Green Mountain Bank." My fingers trembled as I signed for it. Inside was a letter, a polite, carefully typed message offering condolences and informing me that as secondary holder, I now had access to my husband's safe deposit box. The renewal date, every Tuesday, 38 years. I sat down slowly, gripping the edge of the table as the truth settled around me like cold fog. Whatever Thomas had been hiding, he had hidden it for nearly 4 decades. And tomorrow morning, I would walk into that vault alone to finally discover everything he had kept from me. The next morning, I woke before the sun. The house was cold, the kind of cold that slips into your bones before you even notice you're shivering. I dressed slowly, choosing the dark green coat Thomas always said brought out the color in my eyes. I don't know why I wore it. Maybe habit, maybe defiance, maybe I just needed something familiar against a day that felt so unknown. I drove to the bank in silence. No radio, no thoughts loud enough to hold, just the road, the frost on the windshield, and the growing sense that whatever waited behind that vault door would rearrange the past 38 years of my life. Green Mountain Bank looked exactly as it always had: red brick, white trim, a small maple tree outside that never seemed to grow any taller. Thomas had walked through these doors every Tuesday for nearly 4 decades. I felt like an intruder stepping into a place that belonged more to him than our own home ever had. A woman in a navy blazer greeted me with a practiced, gentle smile. "You must be Mrs. Carter. I'm Dana. I'll escort you to the vault." Her voice was soft, but my heart thudded hard enough that I barely heard her. She led me through a hallway lined with framed photos of smiling bankers and ribbon cuttings. Thomas used to comment on them, on how banks love their little pageantry. He said it with amusement, and something else, something I had mistaken for pride. Dana unlocked a heavy metal door, stepped aside, and gestured inward. Box 1123 is yours whenever you're ready. Take all the time you need. The vault was colder than outside. Rows of metal boxes lined the walls like silent witnesses. Dana handed me a key, then left, the door clicking shut behind her with a sound that felt final. I slid the key into box 1123. It resisted for a moment, like it didn't want to open, but then it released with a soft, metallic sigh. I pulled out the long metal drawer. It was heavier than I expected, much heavier. Inside was a neat stack of folders, Thomas's handwriting, sharp and meticulous, labeled each one. He had always prided himself on perfect penmanship. Seeing it here, on these secret files, made my stomach twist. The first folder was labeled Investments, Actual. I opened it, page after page of numbers. Losses, failed ventures, risky purchases that had crashed. It looked like a financial obituary. But these weren't investments we had ever discussed. These weren't part of the retirement plan he'd sworn was solid. These were accounts in his name only. Accounts he'd hidden. I whispered to myself, "Thomas, what were you doing?" The second folder was thicker, labeled Property Equity, Vermont. Property we only had one home, the house on Maple Ridge Lane. At least, that's what I thought. Inside were loan documents, 3 of them, all taken out against a small cabin property I had never heard of, and the name listed on that deed, my name, not his, mine. I stared at the signature. It looked like mine, but not mine. The angle of the M was slightly wrong, the loop of the H too narrow. Someone had forged my name on loans totaling $243,000. My knees weakened. I gripped the table to steady myself. Thomas didn't just hide financial trouble. He used my forgotten property, something I'd inherited from an aunt decades ago, and never formally transferred, to secure his debts. He had kept the address, the deed, everything hidden from me. A property I didn't even know I legally owned had been drained dry to pay for mistakes he never admitted. I felt a burn rise in my chest. Grief, betrayal, anger, everything mixed together into something sharp and wordless. The third folder was thinner, almost gentle looking, labeled simply, "For Helen." Inside was a sealed envelope with my name written in Thomas's precise handwriting. My heart stuttered. I wasn't ready. Not yet. I set it aside. At the bottom of the drawer was a small stack of receipts, monthly transfers, 12 years' worth, all sent to the same person. A name I didn't recognize, Grace Whitmore. Address Athens, Ohio. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. A woman. 12 years of payments. Thousands upon thousands of dollars. My mind leapt instantly to the darkest explanation. Affair, secret life, a second family. But something didn't fit. Thomas barely traveled. He worked overtime, spent weekends fixing things, and went to the bank every Tuesday, like clockwork. That routine had been unshakable. He didn't have time for a double life. So why had he been sending money to her? And why did the payments begin exactly 12 years ago? What happened that year? The room felt too small, air thinning, walls tightening. I needed answers. I needed the truth buried somewhere in these folders. I picked up the envelope again. Thomas's handwriting staring back at me like an accusation or a plea, but I still couldn't open it. Not yet. Not before I learned who Grace Whitmore was and why my husband had spent 12 years paying her money he drained from a life we'd built together. I gathered the folders, pressed them against my chest, and walked out of the vault, my legs shaking as though the ground itself was shifting under me. Because in a single hour, Thomas Carter had become a stranger, and the marriage I thought I understood was beginning to unravel thread by thread. I didn't open Thomas's letter until late that night. The house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ribs. Michael had gone home, Laura hadn't called, and I sat alone at the kitchen table, the envelope resting beside a cooling cup of tea I couldn't bring myself to drink. For a long time, I simply stared at his handwriting, that careful, deliberate script I had seen on birthday cards, grocery lists, sticky notes on the fridge reminding me to buy more cinnamon. There was tenderness in his handwriting, and now something like fear. I slid my thumb under the flap and opened it. Helen, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. I paused. My throat tightened. I don't know how to explain what I've done, or why I did it the way I did. 12 years ago, I made a mistake, a terrible one, and I have spent every Tuesday since then trying to fix it. 12 years. The same year the payments to the woman Grace Whitmore began. Thomas continued, I invested in a new rail company. I believed in it. I thought it would change everything for us. I wanted to give you a future where you never had to worry about money again. I closed my eyes. He had always carried this strange pride in being the provider, the protector. But there was something else in the words, a tremor, a confession bracing itself to break free. It failed. Helen, it failed so fast, I didn't even have time to breathe. Before the losses swallowed everything. I tried to tell you, a dozen times, but every time I looked at you, you were smiling at something small birds at the feeder. You're knitting, a recipe you wanted to try, and I couldn't bear to place my failure into your hands. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. He had mistaken secrecy for kindness. He had mistaken silence for love. But this isn't the whole truth. The letter went on. There is something more. Something I never wanted you to know. My hands trembled. This was the part I feared. I wasn't just paying debts from my investments. I was paying a debt of another kind. One I owed to a person you've never met. Grace. Her name flashed in my mind with cold clarity. 12 years ago, there was an accident on the line. I was supervising that day. A coupling failed on a freight train. A man was injured badly. He survived for a few hours. Just enough time for his wife to reach the hospital and sit beside him as he slipped away. His name was Whitmore. My breath caught. Grace Whitmore. The payments. The sudden start 12 years ago. They said it wasn't my fault. Thomas wrote that the equipment failure wasn't because of anything I did. But I knew better. I had signed off on a maintenance delay to save time. I didn't think it would matter. I didn't think it was dangerous. I was wrong. My stomach twisted into a knot. I couldn't bring him back. I couldn't erase what I'd done, so I decided to help the only way I knew how. I sent money every month so Grace could raise her daughter without the weight of debt. I didn't want you to carry that burden. Helen, it wasn't yours to carry. I set the letter down slowly. My heart was beating too loudly, like it wanted to drown out the words. So it wasn't an affair. It wasn't love. It wasn't betrayal in that way. It was guilt. Pure, crushing guilt. But the letter wasn't done. I used the cabin property because it was in your name, because it was the only asset untouched by the company losses. I meant to tell you. I meant to fix it. But every Tuesday, there was another bill, another transfer, another attempt to make things right. And the longer it went on, the more impossible it became to undo. I felt a wave of grief wash over me, not for the man I lost, but for the man who spent 12 years drowning alone. Why didn't he tell me? Why did he think secrecy would save us? Why did he decide, without my consent, that I should bear the cost of his guilt? The letter ended simply. I'm sorry, Helen, for everything you will have to face now, for every Tuesday, for every secret I carried instead of sharing with you. I hope someday you will understand why I chose the wrong way, to do what I thought was right. I loved you. I never lied about that. I folded the letter with shaking hands, not because I forgave him, not because I understood, but because the weight of his choices felt too heavy to hold all at once. Thomas hadn't been living a double life. He had been living in a double prison, one built of guilt and one built of fear. But now those walls, his walls, were collapsing onto me. And before I could even begin to untangle what his confession meant, I still had one impossible question left unanswered. Why had Thomas kept sending money even after the Whitmore daughter recovered and graduated high school? The transfers hadn't stopped. In fact, they had increased. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's letter spread open beside my coffee. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The words kept circling in my mind, curling around themselves like smoke. An accident. A man dead. A widow in Ohio he had quietly supported for 12 years. But what I still didn't understand was the pattern Michael had pointed out the night before. The transfers didn't end when Grace's daughter recovered. They increased, sometimes doubled. If Thomas's guilt was rooted in that single accident, why did he keep paying long after the family no longer needed medical help? There was only one way to find out. I found Grace Whitmore's number through an old directory listing attached to one of the transfer receipts. My hands were unsteady as I dialed. I almost hung up when the line clicked. Hello, a woman's voice, tired, careful but warm. Mrs. Whitmore, my name is Helen Carter. I believe you knew my husband, Thomas. Silence, then a soft inhale. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, I did. May I ask why he sent you money all these years? Her voice wavered. If this is about judgment, Mrs. Carter, I don't deserve any more of that. I've been judged enough for accepting help. No, I said quickly. I'm not calling to accuse you. I need to know the truth. Another pause. Longer, heavier. Then you should come see me, she said. There are things you'll understand better in person. I hesitated. Vermont to Ohio was not a small drive. But something inside me, an instinct older than grief, told me this was the only way forward. 2 days later, I knocked on the door of a small, weathered, blue house on the edge of Athens. Grace Whitmore opened it with cautious eyes. She was younger than I expected, though hardship had carved shadows beneath her smile. Mrs. Carter, she said gently, thank you for coming. Her home was modest, well-kept, but worn, as though each corner held a memory too heavy to repaint. She brought tea to the table, and for a moment we just sat there, 2 women bound by one man's silence. Finally, she spoke. Thomas started helping us after my husband died. I didn't know anything about the accident at first, only that the company sent a formal letter in a small settlement that barely covered the funeral. But then, 1 month later, a check arrived. From Thomas, not the company. I nodded. The beginning lined up with his confession. He told me he was making things right. I didn't understand what he meant until later, but I was raising a sick child and drowning in bills. I didn't ask questions. She looked down, ashamed, I know people whispered that maybe he and I had something between us, but I promise you, Mrs. Carter, he never crossed that line. He was kind, that's all. I believed her. Thomas had many flaws, but infidelity had never been one of them. His betrayals lived in ledgers, in silence, not in other women's arms. But there's something I still don't understand. I said, the payments increased, even after your daughter recovered. Why? Grace swallowed hard. Her eyes glistened. Because of Noah. I frowned. Who is Noah? She took a deep breath. Noah is not my child. He's the son of the man who worked under Thomas, the man who died in the accident. My husband was only passing through the station that day. The man who died, Jacob Whitmore, he was the employee Thomas felt responsible for. My heartbeat slowed. A new thread, one Thomas hadn't written about. Jacob left behind a baby. Grace whispered. A newborn. His wife had passed away the year before. I became guardian for a short time. And Thomas stepped in, not just with money. He sent letters, Christmas gifts. He checked in every Tuesday, always Tuesday, as if he had chosen one day to face his guilt. My breath caught. He helped raise that boy from a distance. She continued, I think he wanted to make sure Jacob's son grew up safe, educated, not feeling abandoned by the world. I felt the air shift around us. What happened to Noah? I asked softly. Last year, he got into a university in Boston. She said, almost smiling. A good one. He wants to be an engineer. Thomas was so proud. He said it felt like closing a circle. My chest tightened. Thomas had been paying for tuition, for a child who wasn't his, out of guilt, and something like quiet redemption. Grace reached for my hand. He carried the burden alone. Mrs. Carter. He never once asked forgiveness. He just paid and paid until he couldn't anymore. I felt tears rise. Not for the secrets, not for the debt, not even for the betrayal, but for the man who punished himself more fiercely than the world ever could. But the story wasn't over, because as I rose to leave, Grace said something that snapped the air in half. There's one more thing you should know. Thomas wasn't just helping Noah. He was protecting someone else, too. I turned. Who? Grace hesitated. I think he was protecting someone in your family. And just like that, everything I thought I understood began to unravel again. The drive back to Vermont felt longer than the drive to Ohio. I kept replaying Grace's final words over and over, each pass tightening the knot in my stomach. He was protecting someone in your family, not helping, not paying a debt, protecting. The word throbbed like a pulse. By the time I reached home, the afternoon light was fading. Michael's car was in the driveway. But Laura's wasn't. She hadn't spoken to me since the day of the funeral. She thought I was tarnishing her father's name with talk of empty accounts and hidden debts. I stepped inside to find Michael sitting at the kitchen table, the same place Thomas's letter had sat just 2 nights before. He looked exhausted, like he'd aged months in days. Mom, he said, standing quickly, I'm glad you're home. I found something, and I think you need to see it. My pulse lifted. He handed me a thin folder, not one from the vault. This one had been tucked behind a drawer in Thomas's desk, discovered only because Michael's sleeve had snagged on a loose screw. It was as though Thomas had hidden it where only accident could reveal it. The folder was labeled in pencil, faintly Laura. My breath caught. Inside were copies of loan documents. A personal loan for $20,000, taken out nearly 8 years ago, in Laura's name, except the signature wasn't hers, just like mine on the cabin loan similar, but wrong in the ways only a familiar eye would notice. The curl of the L too tall, the cross of the T too sharp. My knees weakened. Dad forged Laura's signature, Michael said quietly. This loan, he took it out to cover one of the failed investments. Then, he tried to pay it down, but he never finished. My chest tightened painfully. Does Laura know? Michael hesitated. Not yet, but she'll have to. The account is in collections now. They want answers. The room felt too small, as though the walls were leaning inward. Laura, our daughter, who adored Thomas, who defended him fiercely, who couldn't bear to hear even the hint of wrongdoing, had been pulled into his hidden world, just as I had. But she didn't know yet. Mom, Michael said gently, there's more. He reached into his coat and pulled out another envelope. This one sealed, but unmarked. I found this with the folder. The handwriting inside belonged to Thomas. Laura, there are things I should have told you. Things I meant to explain when the time was right. I made mistakes trying to protect everyone, but ended up hurting the people I love the most. My throat tightened. You once told me that strength is admitting when you need help. I should have listened. Then the line that stopped my breath. Someday, you might hear that I betrayed our family. Please believe this every choice I made to keep you safe. Safe from what? I reread the sentence slowly. Laura wasn't just collateral damage. Thomas thought he was protecting her. But protecting her from what? From whom, or from the consequences of something she had done? Michael, I whispered. Do you know what he means? He hesitated. Then he sat down heavily. 8 years ago, he said, right around when this loan was taken out, Laura got into some financial trouble. I frowned. She never told me. She didn't want anyone to know. He said she got trapped in one of those online scams. She thought she was helping a friend, and she wired money. A lot of money. It nearly wiped her savings. She was embarrassed, terrified. Dad stepped in. He told her he'd handle it, and somehow, he did. My heart dropped. Thomas hadn't taken that loan for himself. He'd taken it to cover a mistake Laura made. A mistake she was too ashamed to admit. And instead of telling me, instead of asking for help, he had woven one more thread into the web of secrets he carried alone. I felt the air shift inside me. Thomas wasn't just paying off debts from guilt and failed investments. He was carrying the weight of our family's mistakes, but hiding them so deeply that the truth had become misshapen, unrecognizable. Michael watched me carefully. Mom, Laura didn't know about the loan. She thought Dad used his own savings. She thought it was over. I closed my eyes. When Laura fought me after the funeral, accusing me of exaggerating, of smearing Thomas's memory, it wasn't just grief speaking. She needed her father to be the hero of her story, the one who saved her, the one who kept her from drowning. And now, I would be the one to shatter that illusion. I looked at the documents spread before me, my forged signature, the cabin loans, Grace's transfers, Noah's tuition, and now Laura's secret rescue. 38 years of marriage, 6 months of unraveling, and suddenly, the picture was shifting again. Thomas wasn't a villain, but he wasn't a saint. He was a man who tried to fix the world with silence and left us to clean up the wreckage. I whispered, more to myself than to Michael. How many people was he trying to save before he finally broke? But I knew the answer wasn't in my house. It was in the last place I expected to return, to the small cabin in Vermont that I didn't even know I owned. Because if Thomas used that property for so many of his secrets, maybe it held one more that he never had the courage to tell. I didn't go to the cabin right away. I needed a day, just one day, to let my thoughts settle into something I could hold without falling apart. So instead of driving into the mountains, I walked into the small town library, where I used to volunteer before I retired. The moment I stepped through the doors, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood wrapped around me like a blanket. I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time in weeks. Ruth, the head librarian, looked up from the front desk. She was in her 70s, silver hair pinned into the same loose bun she'd worn for decades. "Helen Carter," she said with a soft smile. "I haven't seen you since the service. How are you holding up?" The polite question hung in the air between us. I could have lied, said I was fine, said I was adjusting, said I was taking things day by day. But after discovering everything I had, the lies, any lies, felt poisonous. "I'm trying," I said honestly. "Some days I feel like I'm walking through fog. Other days, I feel like the ground is shifting underneath me." Ruth nodded knowingly. Grief does that, and so does truth. Her words startled me. I hadn't mentioned truth, but Ruth had always sensed things beneath the surface. She gestured toward the reading area. "Sit with me. Tell me what's weighing on you." For a moment, I hesitated. Then the weight on my chest became too heavy to carry alone. So I told her. Not everything, but enough. I told her about the loans in my name, the forged signatures, the money sent to Grace, the accident, the secret support of a boy named Noah, and now, the loan taken out in Laura's name. Ruth listened without interrupting, without reacting, without judgment. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "You're not the first woman to learn the truth after her husband dies," she said, "and you won't be the last. Men of Thomas's generation, they carried everything. Pride, fear, guilt, responsibility. They built their own cages and then dragged their families inside without meaning to." Her voice softened. "But you're stronger than you think, Helen, and you're not alone." I hadn't realized how much I needed those words. Not comfort, just recognition. As the afternoon light shifted across the library floor, a young woman approached the desk. She was maybe in her 30s, her shoulders hunched, eyes red as though she'd been crying for days. "Excuse me," she said to Ruth, then turned to me. "Someone in town told me you might know about financial issues in marriage. My husband handles everything. I don't even know what bank we use. And lately, he's been hiding mail, taking calls outside, snapping when I ask questions." Her voice cracked. "I feel crazy. Am I crazy?" I shook my head gently. "No, you're not." She swallowed hard. "I don't know what to do." I guided her to a chair and spoke in a tone I didn't recognize as my own, steady, warm, grounded in something deeper than knowledge, something lived. "Start with the bank," I told her. "Ask for statements, make copies, look at everything in your name. Secrecy in marriage rarely protects you. It usually traps you." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for believing me." Her gratitude stirred something inside me, something I hadn't felt since before Thomas died. Purpose. After she left, Ruth studied me with thoughtful eyes. "You're good at this," she said softly. "You listen. You don't judge. And you speak from experience. You know what it feels like not to be believed. That's rare, Helen." I sat back, letting her words settle. "I never wanted any of this," I said quietly. "I know," Ruth replied, "but life hands us things we didn't ask for. What matters is what we do with them." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the young woman, about Grace, about Laura, about all the women whose lives were quietly shaped by someone else's decisions. By morning, I knew what I needed to do. I returned to the library and spoke to Ruth. "Would it be all right," I asked, "if we hosted a small support group here, once a month, for women dealing with financial issues, emotional manipulation, or even just confusion about their own households?" Ruth's eyes lit with a kind of fierce approval. "I think it's exactly what this town needs. And so we began, quietly, modestly. 3 women came the first week, then 5, then 9. They told stories that mirrored pieces of my own accounts taken in their names, loans they never signed, husbands who protected them by keeping them in the dark, partners who said you don't need to worry about that, as though ignorance were a gift. I listened. I guided. I shared what I knew, not as an expert, but as someone who had walked through the fire and survived. But the more stories I heard, the more something pressed against the back of my mind. The cabin, the property Thomas used for nearly everything he hid. If he kept so many secrets in drawers and boxes and bank vaults, what else had he tucked away in a place I didn't even know belonged to me? By the end of the 6th meeting, I knew I couldn't delay any longer. I had to go to the cabin. I had to see what Thomas left behind, not in documents, but in the place he had chosen as the silent witness to his secrets. And somewhere, buried in that forgotten piece of Vermont woods, I sensed there was one truth Thomas never found the courage to write down. A truth I was finally ready to face. The road to the cabin curved through miles of pine forest, the trees leaning close, as though guarding whatever waited ahead. I hadn't been to this place since childhood, when my aunt still lived there. I barely remembered its shape, its scent, its quiet. And yet, as the gravel crunched under my tires, a strange sense of recognition stirred inside me, like stepping into a long-forgotten chapter of my own life. The cabin appeared through the trees, small and weathered, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of years. Moss clung to the stones, like old memories refusing to lift. I stepped out of the car and inhaled the cold mountain air. It tasted of pine, damp earth, and something unfinished. The door stuck slightly when I pushed it open, groaning as though protesting my return. Dust floated in the sunlight that filtered through the broken blinds. The air held the faint scent of wood smoke and thyme. I walked through the small kitchen, my fingers brushing the counter where my aunt used to knead dough. Every corner felt familiar, yet distant, like looking at a life through frosted glass. But it was the back room that drew me in. Something felt different there. The floorboards were cleaner, less dusty. Someone had been here, recently. My heart thudded. On the far wall was an old cedar trunk. I remembered it vaguely. My aunt kept quilts and winter blankets inside, but the lock looked new. A padlock, sturdy, shiny, not something left from my aunt's time. My hands trembled as I tested it. Locked. Of course it was. Thomas had been here. He had stood in this room, touched this trunk, chosen it as the hiding place for something he hadn't dared put into a bank or a folder or a letter. I searched the room for a key, checking drawers, shelves, even beneath loose floorboards. Nothing. But as I knelt, my hand brushed the inside lip of the wooden window frame, and I felt a small metal shape tucked into the crack. A key my breath caught. I sat before the trunk, key in hand, my pulse loud in my ears. The lock clicked open with a soft, final-sounding snap. Inside were more files, yes, but also objects, personal ones, a photo, a stack of letters, a small wooden box wrapped with twine. I lifted the photograph first. Thomas stood beside a young boy, Noah. Even without Grace saying his name, I would have known. They shared the same gentle seriousness, the same posture of trying to take up as little space as possible. The mountains behind them suggested this very cabin. Noah looked about 12. I stared at Thomas's face. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't sad either. He looked responsible, as if he carried the world on his shoulders. and believed carrying it made him righteous. I set the photo aside and picked up the letters. They were addressed to Noah, dozens of them. I'm sorry I can't visit more often. One day you'll understand why grown-ups make complicated choices. You are not responsible for your father's death. You deserve a future untouched by my mistakes. My throat tightened. Thomas hadn't just paid tuition. He had mentored the boy from afar, guided him through grief, confusion, school, adolescence. But why hide this from me? Why hide something born from compassion instead of shame? The answer came when I reached for the small wooden box. Inside was a document envelope. I unfolded the paper slowly. A guardianship petition. Thomas had once considered adopting Noah, or taking legal guardianship during the boy's early years. He hadn't filed the papers, his signature never reached the dotted line, but he had drafted them, prepared them, carried them in secret. A quiet exhale escaped my lips. He had wanted to bring Noah into our home, into our life, and decided against it, not because he didn't want the boy, but because he didn't want to burden me. Or perhaps because he feared the truth of the accident would unravel everything we had. My tears fell silently onto the paper. Thomas wasn't hiding a betrayal of love. He was hiding the possibility of a second chance, one he didn't believe he had the right to claim. But there was one more envelope inside the box. This one was addressed to me. Again, hands shaking, I opened it. Helen, if you find this, it means you finally know everything. Or at least, everything I was brave enough to write down. I read each line slowly, my breath catching on the ones that felt too heavy to swallow. I wanted to adopt Noah. I wanted to give him the future I stole from his father. But I couldn't bring myself to ask you to share that burden. My vision blurred. I didn't hide this because I didn't trust you. I hid it because I didn't trust myself. I thought, if you knew the whole truth, you would look at me differently. And I couldn't bear that. I closed the letter gently. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not anger, but a profound sadness for the man who had lived between guilt and love, never believing he deserved either. As I packed the letters and documents back into the trunk, one thought settled over me like falling snow. Thomas wasn't only trying to fix the past. He was trying to spare our family from becoming part of the wreckage he carried. But he failed, not because he didn't try, but because secrets, no matter how lovingly kept, always rot from the inside out. And standing alone in that quiet cabin, I realized something else. This story, our story, wasn't finished yet. There was one more conversation I still had to face. One more truth I still had to speak. With Laura, the daughter who believed her father was flawless and who would have to learn, like I did, that love and imperfection often exist in the very same breath. When I look back on this journey, not just as a woman who lived through it, but as someone who has now listened to the stories of so many others, I've learned something important. Secrets don't simply protect us. They shape us. They reshape the people around us. And eventually, they fracture the foundation we thought was unbreakable. In my support group, I hear the same quiet patterns repeated over and over. A partner says, "Don't worry about it. Mail goes missing. A signature doesn't look quite right. A Tuesday morning routine becomes something no one questions anymore." Financial silence is one of the most invisible forms of harm, and also one of the most powerful. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this: your future deserves clarity, your life deserves honesty, and your heart deserves partnership, not secrecy dressed up as love. If something feels wrong, look closer. If something doesn't add up, ask questions. And if your world ever falls apart the way mine did, remember, It is never too late to rebuild. Not at 50, not at 60, not even at 70. And if this story helped you see something in your own life a little more clearly, I hope you'll stay connected. Go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel, not just for this story, but for the ones that might help you, comfort you, or even save you someday. Thank you for listening, and take care of yourself. You're stronger than you know.